Good. We got prayer going. Okay. So, Romans chapter 8. That's where we left off last time. Was Romans chapter... Is that where we left off? Yeah, Romans chapter 8, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Romans chapter 8. So, I believe we left off at Romans chapter 8, verse 29 and 30. Now, I don't want to spend too much time review, but we haven't actually met in a while. So, wanted to kind of get that going here a little bit. 29 and 30. So, if you're looking there, find Romans 8. 29 and 30 is where we left off. For who he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that we might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, those he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, those he also glorified. Now, we went through each step of that piece of the puzzle so that we could understand what's being said here. Verse 29, I think, is hugely pivotal for us as Christians, because I think this is us. This is right there, smack dab, in our face. This is what we're about. Okay? We are called, or we are predestined, we're called, we are set up to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's what we're all about. That's what we should be about. That's all the Christian faith should be about, is being conformed to that image. And each step kind of tells us a little bit of that process, and I think that process is so hugely important to us as a Christian. I went through each and every word last time. Not going to review that. But I will go over it a little bit here as we move into chapter 8, verses 31 through 36. Because Paul goes on, Paul's asked lots of rhetorical questions. Verse 31 is another one that's coming up here. But he said that moreover, in verse 30, he says, moreover, those he predestined, okay, those that he talked about ahead of time, he foreknew. In verse 30, in verse 29, he foreknew, all right, and then he predestined, and then he called, and then he justified, and then he glorified, okay? So the example I used last time, which I will refresh your memory, because I know that you just remember all that stuff from such a long time ago. I use the example of like a teacher in a classroom, okay? So I'm the teacher, I'm in the classroom, I'm teaching a specific subject. The subject I'm going to be teaching is God's grace. So I have a list of all the students that are going to be there, and I have that list that was predetermined. I foreknew, I knew ahead of time what that list was, and I had these kids, or these people, set up to be in this class ahead of time before the class even began. I kind of set the seating arrangement for all the people, so I know where the kids are going to sit. I know where everybody's going to sit. I already know ahead of time what my curriculum is going to be. Like, I know what I'm going to teach. I'm not just going to wing it every time I come into class. I already know what I'm going to teach. I know all that kind of stuff. So when we look at that, God foreknew, okay? He knew who was going to be there. He predestined where everybody's going to be and all that. He calls them like he's calling roll, all right? Larry, are you here? Yes, I'm here. Oh, good. I knew you were going to be here. I already set up the fact that you're going to be here. I got your seat right there for you, ready to go.
Not beside you.
All right. And then...
in the back.
In the back row. And then he justifies those people who were called because they're in that class. And then through that class, through that justification, he glorifies those people. So just kind of a simple example to kind of wrap our head around that process, so to speak, in verses 29 and 30. All right, so then we go on to 31 through 36. Everybody kind of remember that? We're kind of getting back to that kind of thing, kind of jogging the memory. We'll go to 31. We'll probably, hopefully, go through the end of the chapter, but we'll do 31 through 36 for right now. And it says, starting in verse 31, "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him so freely give us all things? Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died, and furthermore is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword, as it is written, for your sake we are killed all day long, we are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Okay, let's stop right there. Lots of stuff in there. It's kind of a big section, lots of stuff to talk about in there. So Paul's continuing this encouragement. This whole thing here in chapter 8 has kind of been an encouragement to us. It started off, if you remember, there was no condemnation. Okay, he got off of chapter 7 kind of like, well, I struggle with the Christian walk myself. But then he jumps into chapter 8. There is no condemnation. So even though you may be like me, there's no condemnation for what you're doing. And he tries to, kind of keep that going and try and keep that encouragement going. That this is no different. And he keeps going through this. But this is kind of the ultimate rhetorical question, because he's asked lots of rhetorical questions. And then, of course, even though it's a rhetorical question, he still goes through an answer. But this one's kind of the ultimate rhetorical question, I think. Is what shall we say to these things? He's not just talking about maybe just like a little individual thing or whatever. He's talking about the whole process. God foreknew, he predestined, he called you, he justified you, he glorified. He went through this whole thing, So what do we say about this whole process? What can you say about this whole process? It's kind of a rhetorical question, and I think, in my mind at least, I think that's just the thing. It's kind of like the building up kind of thing, where you talk, you're talking about, well, what do you think about this and what do you think about that? If you're talking about an individual class, okay, of people, well, what do you think about Larry? He's a great guy. What do you think about Sandra? She's a great guy. What do you think about Karen? She's a great guy, a gal. What about Donald? Oh, he's a great guy. And what do you think? What can you say about this class? You know what I mean? Sure, you're looking at, you look at aspects, you're looking at individuals, you're looking at pieces of the puzzle, but then here, I think this is kind of the ultimate one where he just comes out. So what should we say about these things? It's kind of where he kind of brings it all together. And as a believer, we need to consider that course of salvation. We can't miss the proactive role that God plays in our lives. You can't sidestep it. You can't not recognize it, and you got to make sure that you're paying attention to it. He foreknew what was going to happen. He predestined it. Not only did he know, he made it that way. Okay? And then he called you to be part of that. He justified you because you're part of that. And then through the process, you're glorified in it. You can't, what do you think about all these things? It's just, God's doing, in that whole process, you also have to recognize the proactiveness of God. Okay? If you look at the whole process, foreknowing, predestining, calling, justifying, glorifying, God does all of it. He's the guy who does it all. The only part that actually we have a role in, per se, is the glorifying part. All right? Which is kind of awesome to know. Because we didn't deserve that. Even if he wanted to help us out, even if we, he decided that we were cool enough to spare or whatever, or have, be part of his family or whatever, he is actually sharing his glory with us. And that's, that whole process of everything that he's going through, he's doing the whole thing, but we actually get to take part in the, we didn't foreknew, we didn't predestine, we didn't call ourselves, and we sure didn't justify ourselves, and we can't glorify ourselves, but that glorification is something that we actually get to take part in. And we actually get to respond in that, which is kind of cool. What do you, so what do you say about that? And that's what he's asking. So what's your response about that? Oh my goodness, look at this whole process. It's kind of awesome. So if you look at verse 31, Paul uses this provisional term. If you look at 31, it says, what shall we say then to these things? And then what does he say? What's that first word there? If. Okay, so if is a condition. Like if you say if of something, if is conditional of something else. Okay? If a condition is met, then something will happen. Okay? But that word there, that term, could actually be substituted with the word because. Or since. Okay, since is good, because is good. So if you're reading this, you could say, what shall we say then? Since God, or because God is for us, okay, who could be against us? Okay? So if you're thinking about all this stuff, because of all this stuff, because God's on our side and He did all this for us, who could stand against us? God's going to go to the whole rigmarole, the whole process of foreknowing and predestining and calling and justifying and glorifying. If He's going to go through all that, who could stand against you? That's God's doing. And God doesn't, do things halfway. He doesn't just kind of roll the dice and hope it kind of works out for Him. He knows what's going down. And this is kind of an awesome thing because, because we know that this is, because God was proactively foreknowing, because He predestined believers to be like His Son, because He faithfully called us, and because He justified us, we will not, we are now faithful to that final step of that glorification. Paul is leading us. He's reassuring us as readers that there is something greater than ourselves in this rhetorical question. It's almost awe-inspiring, this question. If you're looking at all this process, you're going to see that this is just an amazing process. And what do you say about it? I mean, what do you say about it? Because if God's for us, who could be against who could be against us? Who could be against us? So he throws out the rhetorical question and yet still answers it. All right? And of course the answer is, well, no one can stand against us. I mean, Satan tries his darndest. There's no way. If God's going to do it, God's going to do it. We had the wonderful opportunity to look at Romans 8:28, knowing that all the things that God does, He does through love. He gets it all together. He knows what He's going to do. He's going to call those things to His purpose, and the outcome is always good. That's just what He does. There is no other outcome for God. God is good. Okay? People have that process in their head. Well, why does God do these things? Why does God allow such things? Well, God does allow some stuff, all right, but He doesn't make those things happen. He doesn't do those things. He doesn't cause evil. He doesn't cause badness. The only thing that He does is good. If these things are happening, that's kind of where people kind of like to sidestep it. Even atheists, they shake their finger at God because I'm not going to take personal responsibility. It's this stinking God that I don't believe in. Well, I think you protest too much. You're arguing about something you don't believe in, but you don't have anybody else to blame. So why not blame God? But God's not the one that does these evil things. Because who can be against this? Who is powerful enough to stand before God? And the answer is simple. Nope. Nobody. And to go even further than that, he throws out 4 things. And I think he makes each question, he throws out these questions and then answers each one of these questions. And I think it's awesome because he's showing the scope of God. Okay? The scope of what mankind's response could be and what God's actual outworkings are. He says in verse 31, who is against us? In verse 31 he says, if God is for us, who can be against us? who could be against us? All right, he's answering that question. In verse 33, in verse 32, he did not spare his own son. He kind of asked this, because or since God is for us, who can be against us? That stands alone. The statement stands alone. And yet he still throws in verse 32. He who did not spare his own son, but with him also freely gave us all things, but delivered him up for us, who shall not with him also freely give us all things? Okay? Who could stand against us? He's willing to go the distance, even to sacrifice his own son. Why would he not follow through with his plan of foreknowing, predestining, calling, justifying, and glorifying? If he's standing for us, who could stand against us? He's not. He's even willing to go the distance to even sacrifice his own son to give us these things. And glorification is the ultimate thing. That's what our ultimate goal is in God. And here we see that he might actually share a little bit with that with us, because we become glorified through him. So it's kind of amazing that he does that. Verse 33, who can bring a charge against God's elect? Okay? We already said, if God's for us, who can stand against us? And then he goes on to say, who could bring charges against God's elect? It is God who justifies. The statement kind of, once again, stands alone, but again, he answers it, who could bring charges against God's elect? All right? There was a problem. We were sinners. And because of sin in our lives, it separated us from God, and it was easy for Satan or anybody else to bring charges against us because we were bad. But now that's all been taken away. For he who did not even spare his son, why would he not foreknow, predestine, call, justify, and glorify? Why would he not go the distance? Okay, so who could bring a charge against God? He already took care of that. God's the one who actually set the bar, set the rules, and in doing so, he found a way to fulfill it completely and give us life everlasting. Okay, so who could bring charges against? And it says it right there. It is God who justifies. Remember the earlier statement that we read? Do you guys remember when it comes to justifying? Do you remember what we heard about God? What is God? God is
the justifier.
He is just.
And the justifier.
And the justifier. Okay? He is just and the justifier. That statement, twofold, about being just and the justifier, identifies him specifically as the one who sets the rules and the one who enforces the rules. Okay? So he was just in his wrath against us. He's just in his anger against sin. And he's also just for wanting to fulfill his requirements that for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, for the wages of sin is death. That he's still going to be just in that. But he's also the justifier. Why? For he who did not spare his own son, why would he not go the distance for us right here? So he now becomes the justifier. And that's why that word comes up again, justifies. Isn't it God who justifies? Okay? Who could bring a charge against us? Well, if you remember, he was just in his wrath, and he was just in wanting to fulfill the requirements of his own rules, his own law, but he becomes the justifier through Jesus Christ by him paying the price, the ultimate price for all of us, and then raising him from the dead makes him the justifier. Okay? And that's why that word pops up again. Bing! Remember that, because that helps you to make that connection. He brings up that same word again because it is God who justifies. And then in verse 34, who is the one who condemns? Okay? This brings us back to the same concept. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died, and furthermore, who also is risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. Let's get to that intercession thing here in just a second here. But we see here, who condemns? Okay, he was just and the justifier. That word justifier helps kind of spark that little memory into us, and then it goes on here to even explain it. Who can condemn? Who could bring charges against the elect? Who's the one that's going to keep us from God? Well, nobody. Because in his justness, he had to fulfill those rules and his own law. And it says right here, isn't it Christ who died and furthermore was also risen, who is at the right hand of God, who makes intercession for us. Okay? He's justified us too. So who could bring charges against us? Nobody. Who is going to be able to condemn us for being able to, even though we may be sinful guys now, I mean, who's going to be able to keep us from God? Nobody. Because everything's been fulfilled. God took care of it all. He foreknew, he predestined, he called, he justified, and he's now glorifying us. Who can bring charges against us? Sure, it makes you mad. Sure, it's going to make Satan upset. These guys, they don't deserve it. Nobody said anything about deserving it. He just said he was going to do it. Okay? And that's the part that just rubs Satan the wrong way. I love it. Because that's what grace is all about. An unmerited favor, something we didn't deserve. And yet God fulfills it. And then, of course, the last thing in verse 35, he says, he who will spare us from the love of Christ, shall tribulation, shall distress, shall persecution, shall famine, shall nakedness, shall peril, so sword. Once again here, who will separate us from the love of Christ? So if you look at each one of these things, they're all kind of they're almost like the same question, but reiterated a little differently. You know what I'm saying? Each one of these aspects is kind of just the same question, but reiterated. And think about it in your own personal life, in your own Christian life. If you've ever talked to anybody about God or talked to them about them, you hear similar things. Like the similar thing brought up all the time, and yet it's just a little different. Like the question's still the same, but it's just a little different here. But the answer is over and over again the same thing. And that word justified kind of ties it all in because that's where it all comes from. But you'll see that right here. Who's going to separate us from the love of Christ? Who is going to condemn us? Who's going to bring up charges against us? Who can stand against God? Nobody. It ain't going to happen. He is just and the justifier. He's the one that did it. He's the one that makes it all right. And then you come to, let me get to this. Kind of jumped ahead, getting all excited. In verse 34, let me get back to verse 34 because I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm getting all crazy. Verse 34, we see a multifaceted answer, which I think is very important to us, that deals with the justification of us portion of the show. I'll just kind of backtrack to 34 before I get to 35 because I'm getting ahead of myself. Don't want to do that. Who is he who condemns? Okay? He brings up four specific doctrines, four specific separate doctrines that are essential to our Christian life. And we need to make sure that we recognize those because they become the four kind of cornerstones or four pillars, you could say, upon which we stand as not being condemned. Okay? Who's going to judge us? Who's going to try and do, who's going to condemn us? Who is the one that's going to judge us? What hope do we have because of that sin? Well, funny you should ask that because he highlights these four great Christian doctrines that we need to look at. First one he says is Christ Jesus is the one who died. That's the first pillar. And that is the doctrine of propitiation or substitution. Okay? The Son of God paid the debt on our behalf. And it's important for us to understand that doctrine. Okay? That is a super huge pillar upon which we stand. That doctrine of propitiation or that doctrine of substitution, because we couldn't do it on our own. You got to make sure that you understand that. We couldn't do it on our own. We needed someone to step in for us, and that's what this propitiation is. Jesus came and he took it upon himself. He provided for us and he substituted himself for us. That wonderful doctrine of propitiation or substitution there. And then he goes on to the next corner, I guess you could say, of what we're talking about here. And he says, who was raised. Okay? And not only he said that he died, he was the propitiation for us, he took our place, but he also was raised. That's the doctrine of resurrection. There's one, you got to understand that these concepts have to go hand in hand with each other. Because we were sinful, Christ was the perfect sacrifice, and he died and shed his blood to wipe the slate clean for us. But it had to go beyond that. Okay? Because we'd screw it up. You know? Because we would ultimately screw it up. Yeah, he's going to wipe the slate clean for us, but then where do we go from there? You know what I mean? We could die for our sin, and we wouldn't get anywhere further than where we were now. Jesus wipes the slate clean for us and makes us clean, but where are we going to go from there? Now that we have that sin gone from us, there has to be something else. Well, that something, foreknew, predestined, called, justified, glorified. So that becomes one of the major pillars that we stand on, is that doctrine of resurrection. Okay? Because that, the Son of God, was raised to new life. And because of the identification that we have with his death, we also have identification with his life. We now can be grandfathered in, or whatever you want to call it, into that. Okay? So that becomes the second of the four kind of legs that we stand on as Christians. Next one. Who is now at the right hand of God. Okay? Who is now at the right hand of God. This is a huge one. This is the doctrine of ascension. God, the Son of God, Jesus, has received a title to ensure his rule and his kingness, or his ultimate judgment over a people. That's huge. Okay? He didn't just die. He didn't just get raised again. But because of that, he has now been given a title over the entire universe. And he rules it as the authority and king over all. Okay? Now we're identified. See how this is starting to come around. We're identified with that propitiation. He took our place for it. We're identified with that resurrection because he raised from the dead. He has now taken his place at the right hand of God and now has a title as being king and ruler and son. We're their rhythm. Okay? Now we get to the last leg that we have on here. Who also intercedes for us. And that's, of course, the doctrine of intercession. God is our advocate. He's our representative in heaven. And he faithfully looks out for our welfare. Okay? And if you look at all four of those rungs, you see it starts here and kind of goes, wow, right back to where we started. He looks out for us. He makes intercession for us. He died for us. Raised for us. He has taken his position in heaven for us and with us because he's looking out for us. Because he died for us. Because you can see how that goes around. You can see how it is stable. It is the four legs that we stand on, and it is ultimately stable upon which God works in and through us. We see that the Father sacrificed his Son to free us from sin. We see that the Son paid the price and set us free, or emancipated us. And then we see that the Holy Spirit, who lives within us, shares in our suffering, shares in our life, in our spiritual life, and he's the driving force for what we can't do. Okay? So with all aspects of God working together, there's a huge question hanging out there. All right? Who can stand against us? Nobody. We've got every leg to stand on, literally. We're good. Okay? And then we get into verse 35. Before I get into 35, I'm sorry, does anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions? I know I'm kind of winging through this. I don't mean to go through. I just get excited. I talk a lot. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Or yes! Sherry! For the win.
Why does it always say, well, I don't know if it's always, but risen again? He only rose one time. Why is it always again when it mentions about him rising?
Excuse me, sorry. I had soccer practice. Now I'm wheezing. It's very sad. I'm getting old. Okay, so he is risen again. So he was, I guess it could be identified with the fact that he used to be here with us, walked in the pool every day with us, things like that. Now he doesn't do that kind of stuff anymore. He was brought in there. That's a good question. I could look at the actual, I don't have the right kind of book with me right now, but I could look at that particular word to see if I can
Yeah, it
identify
just-
why it is, why it
Usually,
says
a lot
it
of times
again.
it'll say risen again. You know, and I always thought, okay, well, it was just once. You know, why is it always again?
Well, I don't have actually again in my translation.
But didn't he did. He arose from the grave.
And he
then-
rose to heaven.
Right.
Right.
And then, well, when, and then after he was seen on earth, then he,
Right. Yeah, he did. He did raise again.
I
He
guess
rose
I'm
from
thinking
dead.
risen from the dead. And so when it says risen again, I guess that's what I'm,
Yeah.
what I'm thinking about is the death, the
Yeah.
life and the death.
But he
of it.
did.
Right after that, it says, "Who is even at the right hand of God."
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. Kind of alludes to that right there. He did raise from the dead, but he also rose to heaven. He rose to his position at the right hand. I mean, he was there already. So once again, that's another circular thing. He was at the right hand of God. I mean, he was in heaven, and then he rose again to that position. So actually, my translation doesn't use the word again. So maybe you need a different translation. I'm just kidding. No, but that's if you do see again, I mean that's kind of the process. I mean he was in heaven, he came to earth, he died and rose again, or he rose, and then he rose to heaven, and rose back to his position. So yeah, he could be a rose again, kind of a thing. But that is an interesting question that you would see that word there again. What was I saying? Oh yeah, does anybody have any thoughts or comments other than again? Again, does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Let me use that word again.
I have one more.
Okay, go.
Not a question.
That's okay.
And when you talked about it last time, about predestination, have you ever heard of, because a lot of, you hear people trying to explain predestination. And this is the way my dad has always done it. And I thought it's a good, but when you look at it, it's kind of like an arch. And when someone comes, it says, for whosoever will, and then when they walk through that arch, as far as the, being saved, God, He predestined us. And then when you turn around, you look back up in the arch on the other side, and it says, chosen from the foundation of the world. So do you see, have you ever heard that before? To try and,
I mean,
it just kind of helps
never heard
me
it.
with the predestination. Well, anyone can come, but then when you walk through and you believe what Jesus did for you, and He predestined you, then you turn around and He said, chosen from the foundation of the world.
well, like I told you before, the word predestined itself, like the word destined or destiny means that you're appointed for something. It is what you're appointed to do that. Okay, so you're going to be appointed to go into heaven. You're appointed to be a Christian. You're appointed for that. Okay, but when you add the word pre, in the Greek it's pro. But if it's pro, it's like being active. If you're active, you put the word pro in there, it means that you're active before something happens. So there's destiny, but you're predestined to that. So not only are you destined to do something, but God knew about it ahead of time. It's something beforehand. So once, going with your arch thing, maybe it's your destiny to go through there, but once you go through there, you turn around and you see that you were pro or
Right,
pre-chosen. Like this was always your arch.
now, what did it say before he went through?
Before the foundation. Oh, whosoever will.
God's God. And He knows. He knew forever who will and who won't.
Yeah.
And He still gave us free will,
Yeah. Absolutely.
but He knows.
Yep.
Because He's God.
Because he foreknew.
Yeah.
See, that's the kicker with this, is because you have to look at the order. He foreknew and he predestined. Isn't that the same thing? No. Okay. He predestined. That deals with the sovereignty of God. You know, everybody has this, you know, ultimate destiny or whatever, but he predestined that was going to happen because he foreknew. You know, we still have our choice, absolutely.
Sure.
But he knew.
Right.
He already knew ahead of time.
He knew what our choice would be.
Yeah, he knows what's going to happen. And because of that, he pre-sets it up. You know what I mean? Just like the analogy with the classroom. I know ahead of time who my students are going to be. So now I pre-set up my seating arrangement. I pre-set up my curriculum. I pre-set up everything I'm going to do to try and teach them and bring them along. You know, if I'm going with your arch thing, I would add one thing to it, and that is maybe if you're coming to that arch, you're seeing that this is something that is a destiny that you see multiple people going through or whatever. But when you get to the arch is exactly the same size. You ever seen those game shows where there's like a wall that's coming at you and it's got the cut up of a human figure, and you have to do like this to make it through the wall? Have you ever seen one of those?
No.
Oh my goodness, you're missing out. It's awesome. But as you go through the arch, you find out that arch is exactly your size. You're the only one that can fit through it. And as you look back and think, well, I saw tons of people fit through there. Nobody else could fit through there because it's exactly my size. You look back and you see that it was pre-set up for you specifically. I don't know. I'm trying to help you with your
And with
arch
the
thing.
predestination, you got to remember that God says, "I'm not willing that any should perish." I mean, that's not what I want, but I gave you free will, and that's a choice that you make. But I know what your choice is going to be because I'm God. And because you've made that choice, I've got plans for you. So,
Yeah, he just that whole foreknew, predestined. You got to look at that order, which is very important. Foreknew knows about the choice. Predestined is pre-setting up. You know what I'm saying? People kind of, and I think I mentioned this last time. People sometimes will think, well, if he foreknew, then he picked some. That's not what foreknew means. If he picked some, he picked some. It doesn't say, hey, I picked some. It says he foreknew. So he knew. So because he knew, he predestined. And because he predestined, and then once he predestined, he called. Does he call everybody at the same time? No. And then once he calls, he justifies. Then after that, does he glorify you right away? No. People get glorified at a different time. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? You know, just kind of that process.
And that where a lot of people, though, say, well, if God predestined you to be saved or whatever, then why should we be, why should we be telling others about, Jesus and what he did and everything?
But we don't
Because
know.
who can bring charges against the elect? Literally, that's what it says.
But what
who can
I'm
bring,
saying,
who,
aren't there
who
people
condemns?
that think about that? I mean, that
Oh,
believe
sure,
that?
absolutely. I've heard people say, before that if God knows something, it becomes reality. So if God knew what choice you were going to make, you would have no choice but to make that choice because he knows what you're going to do. So then choice actually gets eliminated from the equation because if he knows what shirt you're going to wear today, then you have no choice but to wear that shirt because he already knows that's what you're going to wear. So then you no longer have the choice. Well, that's not true. Okay? He foreknows what choice you're going to make, or what if you didn't make that choice, you made a different choice. He'd know that too. But he knows what choice you're going to make. He knows what shirt you're going to wear. You know what I mean? And because he knows what shirt you're going to wear, he's going to predestine that shirt could be helpful to somebody else throughout the day. Somebody's going to come up to you and go, "Oh, that's the cutest blouse I've ever seen." And then that may give you the opportunity to talk to that person about something. You get what I mean? That it's kind of a feeble kind of a example, but it works. You know, he knows what choice you're going to make, and because he knows what kind of choice you're going to make, he predestined you. And then once he predestined you, he calls you when the time is right. When the time's right, he calls you, and then he justifies you, and then you get glorified.
I'm just saying, a lot of people, I think that because that's the way God is, then I don't have to tell others about Jesus.
Right.
And about,
No, absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely. There's a lot of people that believe that. Well, how can I have free choice? Or how can I have a choice if God knows everything? Well, that's just dumb. Because how else would, God has to know everything. Because if he didn't know everything, he wouldn't be sovereign. He wouldn't be able to interwix. He wouldn't be able to work all things together for good. You know what I mean? So he has to know, he has to foreknow everything. Okay? That's what part of his sovereignty is about. And once he foreknows, well, then he can set things up. Now, because he foreknows, does that mean he made the choice for you? No, it just means he knows.
right.
He just knows. And he knows ahead of time. Why does he need to know ahead of time? Because if he's going to orchestrate everything together, he needs to foreknow. He doesn't need to know when you make the choice. He needs to foreknow when you make the choice. But that foreknow comes, when we're talking about that process, foreknow has to come before predestined. You get what I mean? Because that's our choice. So he knows, and then he works his little thing from there. You get what I mean? But absolutely, that's I hear it all the time. I've heard it. Well, why should I even bother? If I'm going to be saved, I'm going to be saved, or if people are going to be saved, they're going to be saved. Well, maybe you're the person that's supposed to tell them. You know, you don't know that. Maybe you're the one. Maybe you're the one that's so close to that person that you could easily lead them to Christ. Maybe you're the one that does that. And that's my answer to them. Well, why should I lead people to Christ? Why should I tell people of Christ? Because you could be the one. The whole process is a chain. And you could be a link in that chain. You could be the first link in that chain. You could be the middle link in that chain. Or you could be the end of that chain where you lead that person to Christ. But you don't know where you are in that chain. And if you don't take up your position as that link in that chain, well, God will find somebody else to do it. And then where does that leave you? High and dry without the blessing of being part of God's plan. And that's sad. You know? I can't tell you, Karen shared something earlier today and it made me think of that kid at camp that I had the opportunity to take a moment and share God's grace with him. You know, I was at camp, I was the game director and activity director, and I, up at camp in California, and I was very busy, and I'm busy every single day. Whenever everybody else is doing something, I'm doing something. You know, when people are out doing their Bible study, I'm going and setting up games, or I'm setting up activities, or I'm running around, I'm doing this and doing that. Sometimes I have to forego having lunch or something like that because I'm setting stuff up and I'm really busy. Finally, it's Friday night. I'm finally done with the very last thing I have to do, and I feel that weight off of me, and I'm just, finally I'm done. You know, camp's over with. Then we're at the campfire where all the kids are taking it upon themselves to tell everybody why they like camp so much. They talk about how some of the things that the speakers have talked about have touched their lives, and they start to share their testimonies and things like that. And this one kid's standing there, and he starts to tell me about a little bit about himself and part of what camp was done. And all I could think about was, I'm finally done with camp. This kid didn't sit there and tell me his testimony or anything like that, but there was a little window there. There was a window that God showed me that I could have jumped through, and I could have been part of that chain. I could have been the guy. I could have been the guy. Led this kid to Christ. And all I could think about was myself. Later on, I found that his counselor actually talked to him and led him to Christ. Thank the Lord that I dropped the ball, but somebody else was there to pick it up. Why? Because he foreknew. And then he predestined. You know? And I missed out on that. I did. that's a memory that will stick with me for the rest of my life. I missed that. You know, God got done what God got done because God works all things together for good. He's going to do what he's going to do because he foreknows, so he predestines. I'm the one that has to live with the fact that I dropped the ball. That's my bad. You know, so that's my response to people. You know, well, why do I have to tell people about God? Because, you know, I might, you know, they're going to figure it out eventually. You know what? You're right. God will do what God's going to do. And he wants to use you. And if you don't want to be used by him, you're going to miss out. And believe me, that's not a conversation I want to have with God. You know, you could be the guy. And instead, you just want to sit there and do nothing. That's sad. So that's the part that, you know, is really important for us to understand on that process. Foreknew, predestined, you know, called, glorified, or called, justified, glorified. We did not get done. It's time, and I didn't finish 35 and 36. I'll make a little note there. We'll finish up 35 and 36, and then we'll finish the end of the chapter, and then maybe we could get to another chapter starting next time. But I want to make sure that I don't. If you guys have questions, absolutely ask questions. This isn't about me sitting up here talking. I can do that all night. But if you do have those questions or thoughts, then I absolutely want to hear those, and we can talk about those. Does anybody have any other thoughts or comments or questions or responses or anything? Okay. Alrighty. Well, we'll finish up 35 and 36, and then we'll go into 37 through 39, and that's the end of the chapter, and then we'll see where we see how we get there, okay? Let's go to the Lord in prayer. We'll finish it out. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this chance that we could be here together, that we could get into your word and talk about stuff. I think that's awesome that we can talk about stuff and understand the importance of your word and how you unfold your plan in our lives. Personally, I'm thankful that you foreknew and predestined. And I hope that you call me to service at different times. Dear Lord, it's my prayer that when that call comes, that I'll be ready. You know, that I'll be, instead of thinking of the selfishness in myself, that I'll listen to that still small voice that you're giving to me, letting me know that there's something greater involved here, greater in store for us, greater unfolding in front of us. And dear Lord, I challenge each of us to do that same thing. Dear Lord, these few verses that we've gone over have given us this wonderful assurance and structure of different legs that we can stand on, different doctrines that you give to us. You give us this wonderful unfolding of how your, you know, every aspect of you, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, all of you are on our side. All of you are working hard for me, to give me grace, to give me that unmerited favor that I don't deserve, and I thank you. I thank you so much for doing that, because I really don't deserve it. And yet, who could stand against me with you on my side? Thank you so much for that, dear Lord. Bless each one of us. Help us to carry this with us throughout our week, and help us to honor you with it as we go through our days. And we ask it in Jesus' precious, precious name. Amen. Okay. Can you hit the button there? Here, I'll hit the button.